Get off my mountain. The voice hit like a door slamming in the dark, final cold and used to being obeyed. Sophia Bennett did not move. Her coat was soaked through, her settlement was ash behind her, and she had nowhere left on earth to go. She looked straight into the eyes of the most feared man in the territory and said, "Make me." He didn't. He stepped back, he let her in. And what she found inside that cabin was nothing like the monster the stories had promised. If you've ever stood your ground when everything told you to run, stay with us. Subscribe. Watch to the very end. And tell us in the comments. What city are you watching from tonight? The fire had started before anyone could warn her. Sophia Bennett had been in the root cellar when she heard the first screams, not the kind that came from accidents. Not the sharp surprise of someone dropping something heavy, but the sustained, tearing sound of people realizing that what was happening to them could not be stopped. She pushed open the cellar door and the heat hit her face like a fist. 3 buildings were already gone: the dry goods store, the post office, the small church that old Reverend Alcott had built with his own hands 12 years before she arrived. The flames were not spreading the way fires spread when they started by accident. They moved with intention. They moved from building to building in a pattern that someone had planned. She understood immediately what she was looking at. This was not a fire. This was a message. She ran for the livery first, because her horse was inside, and because a woman without a horse in this territory was a woman without options. The door was already hot when she grabbed the handle, and she burned her palm pulling it open, but she got 3 horses out before the roof came down, her own bay mare, and 2 others that belonged to neighbors she would never see again. She tied them to the fence post at the edge of the settlement, and she ran back into the chaos because she could still hear people shouting. What she found in the next 30 minutes would mark her for the rest of her life. Cora Mullen, who sold eggs and mended clothes and had 7 grandchildren she talked about every single day, was sitting in the dirt outside what used to be her house, holding a tin cup and staring at nothing. The cup was empty. Sophia grabbed her by both arms and looked into her face, and Cora looked back with eyes that had already gone somewhere else. "Cora, can you walk?" The old woman blinked once. "They said we had 30 days. They said 30 days, and then we had to be gone." Her voice was distant, almost peaceful, which was worse than if she had been screaming. "I thought 30 days was enough time to find somewhere." Sophia's chest went cold. "Who said that? Who gave you 30 days? "The men from Harlow Creek. The land company men. They said the territory grant had been reassigned and we were all us trespassing." Cora looked down at the tin cup in her hand. "I thought they were bluffing." Sophia already knew the name. Harlow Creek Land Development. She had seen their notices posted in 3 different towns during the past year, official-looking documents with seals and signatures that felt legitimate enough to intimidate anyone who didn't know to look closer. She had asked a traveling attorney about one of those notices 6 months ago, and he had told her that half of what those land companies put on paper was fiction dressed up in legal language. But legal language or fiction, the fire was real. She got Cora onto one of the spare horses and helped 4 other survivors do the same. Martin Hess, who had a gash across his forehead that was bleeding badly. Young Pete Walcott, who was 16, and kept saying he needed to find his father, without understanding that his father's voice was not among the ones she could still hear. And the Deering sisters, June and Alice, who were holding each other's hands and not letting go. Not even when Sophia was trying to lift June onto the horse. "Where are we going?" Martin asked. He was pressing his sleeve against the cut on his head, and his eyes were going glassy. "North," Sophia said. "North is the mountain." "I know what north is, Martin. Nobody goes into those mountains, Sophia. You know what lives up there." She tightened the last saddle strap and turned around to face him. "What lives up there is better than what just happened down here." She said it with more certainty than she felt, because certainty was the only currency she had left. They moved north. She had heard the stories about Levi Hunter the same way everyone in the territory had heard them in pieces. Over time, from people who all claimed to know someone who had actually seen him. The stories were never exactly the same, but they always had the same shape. He was enormous. He had killed men with his bare hands. He did not speak to strangers. He had once turned an entire surveying party around at gunpoint and sent them back down the mountain without their equipment. A trapper named Burl Cassidy had reportedly wandered onto his land 3 years ago and had not been seen since. and people let that sentence hang in the air without finishing it. Sophia had always filed those stories in the same place she filed most of the things men said about things they were afraid of, somewhere between exaggeration and outright invention. But riding north into the darkness with 5 people who were depending on her and a burned palm that was beginning to throb with genuine violence, she found herself thinking about those stories with considerably less skepticism than she had before. They lost Martin Hess 3 miles from the settlement. Not to the mountain, not to anything dramatic. His wound was worse than it looked, and the blood loss had been working on him quietly the whole time they were riding. And somewhere in the darkness to settlement and the first tree line, he simply slid off his horse and did not get up. She stopped everything. She got down on her knees beside him in the dirt. His pulse was still there, thin but there. She tore the hem of her underskirt and bound his head properly, and she made June Deering hold the bandage in place while she figured out what to do. She could not take him up the mountain. She could not leave him in the open. There was a small trading post Eckhart's about 6 miles east. She had passed it twice. If she could get Martin to Eckhart's, the old man who ran it would have basic supplies and a warm structure at least. She looked at the 4 people, still on horses. June, Alice, you take Martin east to Eckhart's. You follow the creek bed, you can't miss it. Tell old Eckhart that Sophia Bennett sent you and that Martin Hess needs a doctor. Alice Deering shook her head hard. We're not leaving you alone. You're not leaving me alone, you're saving Martin's life. Sophia looked at her steadily. I need you to do this. I need you to do exactly this and nothing else. There was a long moment. Then June Deering reached over and squeezed Sophia's hand, once hard, and the 2 sisters began maneuvering Martin's body back onto a horse. That left Pete Walcott. He was 16 years old, and he had stopped saying he needed to find his father, which meant some part of him had accepted what that meant. And he was sitting on his horse with his jaw clenched so hard she could see the muscle working in his cheek. I'm staying with you, Pete said. She considered arguing. Then she looked at his face and decided that sending him off alone in the dark would do more harm than taking him with her. Stay close, she said, and if I tell you to stop, you stop. If I tell you to go back, you go back. Yes, ma'am. They rode north into the trees. The cold became serious about an hour into the climb. Sophia had a coat, her good wool coat, the one she'd had for 4 years, the one she had bought with 2 months' worth of egg money when she first arrived in the territory, because she'd been warned about the winters and she had decided that freezing to death was an undignified way to go. It was a good coat. It was not good enough for them. The temperature dropped in a way that felt almost aggressive, like the mountain was testing something about her specifically. And the trees closed overhead and blocked out what little moonlight had been helping her see. And for 20 minutes, she was navigating almost entirely by instinct and by the sound of water somewhere to her left. Pete said nothing. She appreciated that about him. The cabin appeared before she smelled the smoke, which surprised her. She had expected to smell a fire from further away. But the trees parted around a small clearing, and the structure was just there, low and solid and dark against the hillside, with a single line of light showing under the door. Someone was inside. She stopped her horse at the edge of the clearing. Every story she had ever heard about Levi Hunter came back to her in a rush, and for 30 seconds she sat completely still and thought very seriously about turning around. She had no money. She had a burned hand and a wet coat and a 16-year-old boy behind her. She had, in the last 4 hours, watched everything she had built in 3 years of hard work turn to ash and smoke. She was not in a position to be selective about her options. She got down off the horse. Stay here, she told Pete. So stay here. She walked across the clearing to the cabin door. She raised her hand and knocked not times tentatively, not frantically, but the way she knocked on every door she had ever needed to open, with the flat assumption that someone on the other side was going to answer her. There was silence, and footsteps, heavy, deliberate, unhurried. The door opened. She had prepared herself, in the 30 seconds of walking across that clearing, for a number of possibilities. A large man, an angry man, a man with a weapon already in his hand. She had not prepared herself for the specific quality of the silence that came off him. Levi Hunter was large in the way that certain things in nature are large, not aggressively, not as a threat, just as a fact. He filled the doorway. His hair was dark, and there was a beard that had not been trimmed recently, and his eyes which were catching the light from inside the cabin, were a shade of gray that Sophia's mind, under better circumstances, might have paused to consider more carefully. He was looking at her with an expression that was almost nothing not hostile, not welcoming, not surprised. The silence stretched. Then he said, "Get off my mountain." And the voice was exactly as she'd imagined it. Low, flat, no room for negotiation in it. And something in Sophia Bennett, something that had been building all evening, through the fire and the blood and the cold and the 30 seconds of walking across that clearing, telling herself she was not afraid that something snapped cleanly. She did not move. She looked straight back at him. With her burned hand and her soaked coat, and her ruined evening, and her 3 years of work reduced to smoke behind her. And she said, "Make me." The silence that followed was of a completely different quality than the one before it. His eyes moved over her face with an expression she could not read, not anger, not amusement, something more calibrated than either. He looked past her at the tree line, at Pete still sitting on his horse with his jaw clenched. He looked back at her. "What happened to your hand?" The question was so far from what she had expected him to say that she blinked. "Fire," she said. "How bad?" "Bad enough." His eyes stayed on her face for another 3 seconds. Then he stepped back from the doorway, not a welcome, exactly, not an invitation with any warmth in it, just an opening, and said, "Come inside." She didn't hesitate. She turned around and waved Pete forward. The cabin was one room. It was not small exactly, it was efficiently used, which was different. There was a fireplace that was doing serious work, and a table, and 2 chairs, and a narrow bed against the far wall, and shelves that held what she recognized as a carefully maintained collection of supplies. Everything had a place. Everything was where it was supposed to be. Levi Hunter's home was the home of a man who had decided that order was not optional. He moved to the fireplace and picked up a cloth and held it out to her without turning around. "Wrap your hand with that. There's water in the pot that's still warm. I don't need you to, I'm not arguing with you." He set the cloth on the table and went to the shelves. "I'm telling you what's available. You do what you want with that information." Sophia looked at the cloth. She looked at the pot of water on the iron hook over the fire. Her hand was throbbing with a persistence that was becoming genuinely difficult to ignore. She took the cloth and wrapped her hand. Pete had come inside behind her and was standing near the door with the expression of someone trying very hard to be invisible. Levi looked at him once, a single, assessing look that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and then went back to what he was pulling from the shelves. "There's bread," he said, "and dried venison. And if the boy looks like he might fall down, there's a blanket on the chest." Pete looked like he might fall down. "Sit," Sophia told him gently, and he sat on the floor, near the fire, with the immediate relief of someone whose legs had been threatening to give out for the last hour. Levi set bread and venison on the table and put 2 plates down. Then he put a 3rd plate on the floor near Pete, without comment. He pulled one of the chairs back and sat in, not at the table, but off to the side, closer to the door. He picked up a piece of work, something leather, a harness that needed mending, and his hands began moving. He was not going to make conversation, that was clear. Sophia looked at the food on the table. She looked at the man in the chair. She pulled out the 2nd chair and sat down and put food on her plate, with the steady, deliberate movements of a woman who had decided that she was going to eat this meal without any drama. "My name is Sophia Bennett," she said. Nothing from the chair. "The settlement 3 miles south caught fire tonight. It wasn't an accident." She tore off a piece of bread. "Harlow Creek Land Development. You know the name?" A pause in the movement of his hands, brief. Then it resumed. "I know the name," he said. "Then you know what they do." "I know what they do." She ate a bite of bread. It was dense and real, and the best thing she had tasted in she couldn't remember how long. "I'm not asking to stay permanently," she said. "I'm asking for 1 night. Until I can figure out the next step. 1 night," he said. "That's all." His hands kept moving on the leather. "The boy sleeps by the fire. You take the bed. Where will you sleep?" He looked up from his work for the first time since he had sat down. The gray eyes found her across the room, with an expression that was not quite impatience and not quite amusement. "I'll manage," he said, and went back to the leather. She did not sleep immediately, which she had expected. Pete was unconscious within minutes, youth and exhaustion forming an uncomplicated alliance, and she could hear his breathing even out from across the room. The fire had settled into a steady, reliable burn. The cabin was warm in a way that felt almost startling after the cold outside. The kind of warmth that your body had to adjust to gradually, that made you aware of how cold you had actually been. She lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and listened to Levi Hunter move around the cabin in the dark. He was quiet in a way that surprised her. For a large man, he moved without waste. She could track him by sound when she tried, but only barely. He added wood to the fire twice. He went outside once for maybe 10 minutes and came back with cold air and the smell of pine. He did not make any sound that suggested he was settling down to sleep. She waited until she was sure Pete was deeply out. And then she said quietly, to the ceiling, "You don't have to stay up because we're here." Silence. Then from near the door, "I'm not staying up because of you." "I sleep light," he said. Always have. It was the most personal thing he had said to her. She filed it away without comment, because commenting would end whatever thin thread of conversation existed. And she found, despite herself, despite the evening, despite everything, that she did not want that thread to end quite yet. "The hand hurts," she said. "It'll hurt worse tomorrow." "That's not comforting." "I wasn't trying to comfort you." She turned her head toward the darkness where she thought he was. "Why did you let us in? Longer this time." "You knocked," he said. "That's the reason?" "Most people don't knock. Most people who come up this far come to take something or prove something." A small silence. "You knocked, and you had a burnt hand and a child behind you." "Pete's not exactly a child. He's 16. He held up better tonight than most men twice his age would have." Something shifted in the darkness, not quite agreement, but not dismissal either. She turned back to the ceiling. "The people from Harlow Creek," she said. "You said you know what they do. Have they come up here? Have they come after you?" "They tried." The flatness in his voice was something specific. Not anger, something older than anger. "Once." "What happened?" The silence stretched long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. "Then they didn't try again." She let that sit. "I need to get back down into the valley," she said. "Not right away. But I need to find out if any of my neighbors made it out, and I need to find someone who can tell me whether those Harlow Creek documents are legal or not. Someone told me once that half of what they filed is fiction. The other half is real enough to bury you with. Then I need to know which half I'm dealing with." He moved, she heard it, and then there was a faint creak that told her he had finally sat down somewhere. "There's an attorney in Millhaven," he said. "Name's Garrison. Elias Garrison. He's dealt with Harlow Creek before." She absorbed this. "How do you know that?" "Because 2 years ago, a family named Prater came up this mountain in almost exactly the same condition you're in tonight." A pause. "I sent them to Garrison." She was quiet for a moment. "Did it help them?" "Some." "What does some mean?" "It means they kept their land and lost their barn and replanted and are still there." His voice was level. "It means they're alive and their children are alive." Sophia stared at the ceiling and felt something she hadn't felt since before the fire started. Not hope exactly, which felt too large and too fragile a word for what she was experiencing, but something directional. Something that told her the next step existed, even if she couldn't see it clearly yet. "Millhaven is how far from here?" 2 days south. "Hard travel." "I've done hard travel, I noticed." It was not a compliment. Exactly. But it was an acknowledgement, and from a man who seemed to offer acknowledgement about as freely as he offered his name, she recognized the weight of it. She closed her eyes. The fire crackled. Pete breathed steadily on the other side of the room. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the trees, with a sound like something being slowly turned over. "Levians. Thank you," she said, "for the food." And a long moment. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "You haven't seen the rules." She almost smiled at the ceiling. It surprised her, the almost smile. She hadn't expected anything like it. "What, tomorrow?" he said. She slept. She woke before full light to the sound of an axe. The fire was still. He had fed it in the night, and Pete was still asleep, on his blanket near the hearth, one arm thrown over his face. She sat up slowly, aware of every physical complaint her body had accumulated in the last 18 hours. The hand, the back, the stiffness in her legs from the cold ride, and the tension she had been carrying since the moment she smelled smoke. She got up and went to the door and opened it. Levi Hunter was splitting wood at the side of the cabin. He had been at it long enough that there was already a significant pile. He worked with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done this exact task so many times that it required no conscious attention. The axe went up. The wood split. He kicked the pieces aside, set the next piece, and the axe went up again. He did not look at her when she came out. She stood in the doorway and watched him for a moment. "How long have you been up?" she said. "While you didn't sleep. Told you, I sleep light." Set another piece of wood on the block. "There's coffee inside, pot on the shelf to the left of the fire." She went back in and found the coffee and poured 2 cups without being asked. And she carried both cups outside and set one on the top of the fence post near where he was working. He glanced at it. He didn't say anything. But when she moved away, she heard him pick it up. She walked to the edge of the clearing and looked south, where the sky was just beginning to lighten. Somewhere down there, in the dark, there was ash and ruin, and a set of very specific people who thought they could simply erase everything she had built. She thought about Cora Mullen with her empty tin cup and her faraway eyes. She thought about the Deering sisters' interlocked hands. She thought about Pete's jaw, clenched so tight it had to hurt. She heard Levi come to stand a few feet behind her. She knew it was him by the way the sound of his footsteps registered not a threat, just a presence. "The people you helped before," she said without turning around. "The Prather others." A pause. "Some. How many people have come up here the way I did last night?" He was quiet for a moment. "More than I expected," he said. "When I first came up here and you helped them. I pointed them somewhere useful." She turned around and looked at him. He was standing with the coffee cup in his hand, and his expression was the same one it had been when he first opened the door, not hostile, not warm, just level. The gray eyes were assessing her with a directness that most people probably found uncomfortable. She did not find it uncomfortable. She found it oddly like something she recognized. "You've been watching what Harlow Creek does," she said. "For how long?" His eyes moved slightly. Not away from her, just a small adjustment, like something behind them had shifted. "Long enough," he said. "Long enough to what they're doing to the valley." "Long enough to know they're not finished," he said. And there it was, something in those 4 words that landed differently than everything else he had said. Not a statement of distant observation, something closer. Something that lived in his chest rather than in his head. She held his gaze. "You know something specific about them," she said. "This isn't just watching from a mountain, you know something?" The line of his jaw tightened, just slightly. Just enough for someone who was paying attention to see it. "Eat breakfast," he said. "Then we'll talk about rules." He walked back toward the cabin. And Sophia stood in the early morning cold and understood, with a clarity that surprised her, that the feared mountain man she had knocked on the door of last night was carrying something that went considerably deeper than isolation. She did not know yet what it was, but she was going to find out. The mountain wind moved through the trees behind her, and somewhere far below, invisible and patient, Harlow Creek Land Development was already planning its next move. And Sophia Bennett, who had refused to be turned away from this door, who had looked into those gray eyes and said, "Make me," was already planning hers, starting with the man who clearly knew far more than he was willing to say over a cup of morning coffee. She went back inside. Pete was awake, sitting up on his blanket with his hair pushed to one side and his eyes carrying the particular weight of someone who had slept deeply enough to forget, for a few seconds upon waking, everything that had happened and then remembered all of it at once. She watched his face go through that process, and she didn't say anything because there was nothing to say that would make it easier. She just handed him a cup of coffee and sat down across from him at the table and let him have the silence he needed. Levi came in a few minutes later, knocked the cold off his boots at the door, and went directly to the shelf without looking at either of them. He pulled down a tin and set cornbread on the table, left over from the night before, dense and still holding some warmth from where it had been wrapped near the fire. He set out dried apple slices and a small jar of something dark that turned out to be preserves. He did not sit down. He stood at the far end of the table and ate standing up, the way a man eats when he has not, in a very long time, eaten at a table with other people present. Sophia watched this without commenting on it. Pete ate with the focused intensity of a 16-year-old who had not had a real meal since the previous afternoon. And for a few minutes the cabin held the particular quiet of people doing a necessary thing together without the complication of conversation. Then Pete set down his cup and looked at Levi with the directness that very young people sometimes have before they learn to be more careful. Are you really as dangerous as they say you are? Sophia closed her eyes briefly. Levi looked at Pete across the table with an expression that did not change. What do they say? Pete's jaw worked slightly. He was not backing down, which Sophia noted with something between admiration and mild alarm. They say you killed a man with your bare hands. They say you ran a whole survey crew off the mountain at gunpoint. They say Burl Cassidy came up here 3 years ago and nobody's seen him since. Burl Cassidy, Levi said. And something moved across his face that was not quite amusement but was in the same county. Went to Denver. He told me he was done trapping and done with this territory and he was going to go live near his daughter. I helped him pack his mule. A pause. The survey crew I turned around because they were working for Harlow Creek, and I recognized 2 of them from a property dispute in Cedar Fork that burned the same way your settlement burned last night. Another pause. And the man I killed with my bare hands didn't give me a choice. Pete absorbed this with the careful deliberation of someone recalibrating a significant number of assumptions. Rumors are easier than truth, Levi said. Easier to repeat, easier to believe. He picked up his. People who are afraid of something don't usually stop to ask questions about it. Sophia looked at him across the table. That sounds like a man who has thought about this quite a lot, she said. I've had time to think. Is that why you stay up here? Because it's easier than dealing with the rumors down below. The gray eyes moved to her face. We were going to talk about rules, he said. We were, she agreed. But you're going to answer my question first. A silence settled between them that had some texture to it, not hostile. Not comfortable either. But genuinely alive in a way that told her this was a man who was not accustomed to being pressed and was deciding, in real time, how he felt about it. I stay up here, he said finally, because it's where I can be useful without being in the middle of something I can't control. She let that sit for a moment. The rules, she said. He set his cup down. You want to stay here while you figure out your next move. Fine. But there are conditions. He was not unkind about it, but he was also not asking. You don't go through my things. You don't ask questions I don't offer answers to. You earn your keep. There's enough work here for 3 people, and there's only been 1. And when I say something needs doing a certain way, you do it that way. Sophia looked at him steadily. And when I think something needs doing a different way, then you tell me why and I'll consider it. You'll consider it. That's what I said. Most men I've known, Sophia said, who say they'll consider something, mean they'll listen long enough to feel polite and then do whatever they intended to do from the beginning. The corner of his mouth moved, just slightly, just for a moment. I'm not most men, he said. No, she said, looking at him squarely. I don't think you are. Pete, who had been following this exchange with the alert attention of someone watching 2 experienced chess players, took a long sip of his coffee and said nothing. The storm arrived that afternoon without much warning. The sky had been pressing down all morning. She had felt it in the quality of the cold, which was different from the night before, heavier and more purposeful, but she had been busy enough that she hadn't given it serious attention. Levi had put her to work immediately after breakfast. Not with anything humiliating or deliberately difficult. Just the genuine labor that a mountain cabin required to function. Wood to be stacked a specific way against the north wall. A set of snares that needed checking and resetting along a specific line through the trees. Water to be hauled from the creek before it dropped further. He worked alongside her on the snares. Not instructing exactly, more demonstrating his hands moving quickly and without fuss, and then standing back to watch her, replicate the motion, and correcting her only when the correction was necessary. It was the teaching method of a man who believed that watching was more useful than explaining, and she found, to her mild annoyance, that he was right about that. Pete he sent to split kindling, which was the right call. Pete needed something physical and repetitive, and with clear, visible results. Something that would let his body outpace his mind for a few hours. The first sign of the storm was the wind changing. She felt it when they were on the 3rd snare, a shift in direction that brought the cold from a different angle, sharper and carrying moisture. Levi straightened up beside her and looked north. Storm, he said. How bad enough? He was already moving. "We need to get the horses in." She followed him without asking for further explanation, because his tone had shifted in a way that told her the time for conversational exploration was over, and the time for moving quickly had begun. They got the horses secured in the small lean-to structure at the back of the cabin that was built for exactly this purpose. 3 animals could fit if they didn't mind the closeness, and horses in a mountain storm minded closeness considerably less than they minded the alternative. They made it back inside with about 10 minutes to spare. The storm hit with the kind of force that made the cabin feel immediately smaller. The walls held they were built by someone who understood what mountain winters actually did. Fitted logs with no apology for aesthetic. The gaps filled with a mixture that Sophia, running her hand along one of them, recognized as serious work, but the sound was significant. The wind found every small imperfection in the construction and made itself known through it. Pete looked at the walls with an expression of involuntary respect. "This place was built to last," he said. Levi was adding wood to the fire with the calm of a man who had weathered a considerable number of storms in this exact room. "Built it myself," he said. "Took the better part of a year." Sophia looked up from where she had been checking the wrapped cloth on her hand, which needed changing. "You built this alone, nobody else to help?" She looked around the room with a different kind of attention than she had given it before. The fitted logs, the careful shelving, the way the fireplace was positioned to throw heat to every corner of the single room. A year of work. Alone on a mountain. She thought about what that meant, not as a romantic notion but as a practical reality. What it meant to spend an entire year with only the problem in front of you, and the silence around you, and no one to confirm that the decision you made yesterday was the right one. Specifically, why this mountain? He had his back to her. The fire was catching well. Because nobody else wanted it, he said. It was a simple answer. She did not believe for a moment that it was the complete one. The storm locked them in for 2 full days. The first day was tense in the way that small spaces and strangers are always tense. 3 people learning the geometry of each other's habits, finding where the friction points were, and navigating around them with varying degrees of grace. Levi needed quiet in the mornings, and she learned this quickly and respected it. She needed to move, to have something productive to do with her hands. And Levi seemed to understand this without being told. He found her tasks without making it obvious he was doing so. Setting out leather that needed working, or a piece of equipment that needed attention. Pete moved between them like a young animal that is working out the social hierarchy of a new pack, watchful, adaptive, occasionally surprising both of them. On the afternoon of the first day, while Levi was running some kind of maintenance on his rifle at the far end of the cabin, Pete sat down near Sophia and said, under his breath, "He keeps looking at you when you're not looking at him." Sophia did not look up from the harness she was stitching. "You're 16 years old, Pete. I have eyes. Use them for something useful." Pete smiled for the first time since the fire. It was a small smile and it didn't last long. But it was real. And she felt it like something being carefully handed back to her, proof that something ordinary was still possible. Even now. The first twist came on the evening of the first day, and it came from a box on the shelf. She had not meant to see it. She had been reaching for the coffee tin, which Levi had moved to a different shelf, and she had misjudged the distance in the low light, and her hand had caught the edge of a flat wooden box and pushed it sideways, and it had opened as it slid. Not all the way, but enough. Enough for her to see the corner of a document inside it. A folded paper with a heading she recognized, Harlow Creek Land Development. She caught the box before it fell and pushed it closed and put it back, and she turned around and Levi was watching her from across the room. He had seen it. He knew what she had seen the corner of. The quality of his stillness told her all of that without a word being exchanged. She held his gaze. She did not reach for the box again. She did not ask about it. She went back to her chair and picked up the harness and went back to stitching. But her heart was moving at a different rate than it had been 60 seconds before. He came and sat across from her 2 hours later after Pete had fallen asleep. He put the box on the table between them. He did not open it. "You saw the header," he said. "I wasn't trying to look." "I know." His hands were flat on the table on either side of the box. "There are things in here I haven't showed anyone." "You don't have to show them to me." A pause. "But I think maybe I need to." She waited. He opened the box. Inside were documents, not one, but several. folded carefully and aged at the edges in a way that told her they were not recent. There were also 2 photographs, which was unusual enough in itself that she felt the small shock of them before she even focused on what they showed. Photographs in a remote mountain cabin meant someone had gone to significant trouble and significant expense to have them made and to keep them. He set one of the documents flat on the table and turned it toward her. She leaned forward and read it. It was a land grant, a legitimate one, with official territorial seals covering 1,200 acres in the Cedar Fork Valley, dated 11 years ago. The name on it was not Levi Hunter. The name on it was James Levi Hunter. She looked up. "Your full name," she said. "My father's land." He tapped the document. "Legally granted. Fully documented. My father built on it for 6 years a ranch, a house, a working property that he meant to pass on." His voice had not changed in tone or volume, but there was something underneath it now that had not been there before, something that was working very hard not to move. Harlow Creek filed a counterclaim. Said the original grant had been issued in error, said the land had been resurveyed, and the boundaries fell inside a parcel they had prior purchase on. Was that true? It was a lie built on a real document. He moved his hand to the second photograph. The purchase document they produced was real. The date on it was not. Someone altered it. Someone with access to territorial records and enough influence to make the alteration stick. She looked at the photograph. It showed a building, a ranch house, solid and well-made, with a cleared yard and what looked like the beginning of a proper fence line. "This was their property," she said. "This was my family's property." He picked up the photograph and set it face down. "My father fought the claim for 2 years. He hired an attorney. He filed counter documents. He went to the territorial office 3 times, a pause. The 3rd time he came home and found the house had been burned." The silence in the cabins was complete. "Were they inside?" she asked quietly. "My mother was." He said it the way you say things that are too heavy to dress up with language. Plain and level, and with a weight that every single word carried equally. "My father lived another 4 months. He did not recover." Sophia sat very still. She understood now. Not everything, not yet, but enough. The mountain, the isolation, the gray eyes that assessed everything at a distance, and let nothing have a very specific and carefully maintained boundary. The people he had quietly helped, the Prater family, and presumably others, pointing them to attorneys, giving them the information she had not known to ask for, doing from a safe distance what he could not make himself do from close up. She said, "Some of the same men. The company name changed twice. The people running it have changed some." He turned the document face down as well. "But the method is the same. The document fraud, the reassignment, the fire when the legal route takes too long." He looked at her directly. "Your settlement wasn't the first, Sophia. It won't be the last." "Then we can't just go to one attorney in Millhaven," she said. Something shifted behind his eyes. "No," he said, "we can't." She caught the word. She held onto it. "We," she said. He looked down at the closed box. "I have been sitting on this mountain for 9 years," he said, "watching what they do, and pointing people toward help and telling myself that was enough." The muscles in his jaw worked. "Your settlement burning last night, I smelled the smoke. I knew what it was before you knocked on my door." She felt something tighten in her chest. "You knew and you stayed up here." He stopped. Couldn't what? His hands pressed flat against the table. "I couldn't make myself go down there again," he said. "Not to another fire. Not to more of what I couldn't stop the first time." It was the most unguarded thing he had said. She could see what it cost him to say it, not in a dramatic way, but in the specific, private way that a strong person bears the exposure of a genuine weakness, which is quietly, with the jaw set, without asking for anything back. She did not offer him sympathy. She understood instinctively that sympathy was not what this moment required. "You didn't go down to the fire," she said, "but you opened your door." He looked up. "You let us in," she continued. "You fed us. You're sitting here right now telling me something you said you haven't told anyone." She held his gaze. "That's not a man who can't do anything. That's a man who has been trying to find the way back to doing something and hasn't found the door yet." The fire crackled. Outside, the storm worked against the walls of the cabin with a patience that had no interest in anything happening inside. Levi looked at her for a long time. "You're a difficult woman," he said. "I've been told I don't mean it as an insult. I know you don't." The second day of the storm was different from the first in ways that were hard to articulate but impossible to miss. The tension was still there, but it had shifted. It was no longer the tension of strangers trying to occupy the same space without colliding. It was something with more voltage in it. The kind of tension that exists between people who have said something real to each other and are now living inside the altered gravity of that honesty. Levi showed her his supply system in the morning not because she asked, but because she was going to be living in this space for at least another day, and he was a practical man who understood that information served everyone better than unnecessary mystery. He walked her through what he had and where it was stored and why it was stored that way, and she asked sensible questions, and he gave sensible answers, and Pete sat in the corner sharpening a knife. Levi had handed him with no instruction other than the angle matters and figured it out. In the afternoon, Levi went through the documents in the box again, not with Sophia watching exactly, but with her present and occasionally asking a question and him answering it. She began to understand the shape of what he had. He had evidence. Not complete evidence, not a clean courtroom-ready case, but the bones of one. The original land grant with its legitimate seal. A surveyor's report he had commissioned himself, years after the fact, that contradicted the boundaries Harlow Creek had claimed. Copies of documents from the Territorial Record Office that he had obtained through correspondence, not originals, but copies, with the discrepancies marked in his own handwriting in the margins. And the photographs. Not just the one of his family's ranch house, but 3 other properties. Other structures. Each of them with a date written on the back in his careful hand. Dates that corresponded to specific claims Harlow Creek had filed. He had been documenting. "You've been building a case," she said. "I've been keeping records." He stacked the documents back into the box. A case requires someone willing to argue it in front of someone with authority to hear it. Garrison, the attorney in Millhaven. Garrison knows some of this already. Not all of it. He looked at the box. I haven't shown him the photographs. Why not? He was quiet for a moment. Because showing him the photographs means finishing what I started, he said. And finishing it means going back down. She looked at his profile, the set jaw, the level gaze directed, somewhere past the wall in front of him. The particular quality of stillness in a large man who is holding something very heavy very carefully. Levi. He turned. You said you have been up here for 9 years pointing people toward help. Her voice was steady. How many people, he considered. 11 families, he said. 11 families you helped. Pointed in a direction. 11 families, she repeated, who might not have found their way without you. She let that sit. You've been doing the work this whole time. You've just been doing it from up here because it felt safer than doing it from down there. The gray eyes found her face. It was safer, he said. For me, yes. She did not look away. And those 11 families needed you to be safe up here so you could help them. That's real. That's not nothing. She paused. But my settlement is ash. And there are going to be more, and you have a box on that shelf that holds the difference between Harlow Creek continuing to do this for another 10 years and them being stopped. She leaned forward slightly. So what are you going to do with it? It was a direct question. She asked it directly because she believed he was the kind of man who responded to directness better than he responded to anything softer. And because she was not willing to dress it up in the kind of gentle language that would let him step around it. He was quiet for a long time. The storm will break tomorrow, he said finally. Maybe the day after, and then? And then, he said. And he looked at the box on the shelf. We need to talk about going to Millhaven. The word again. The same word he had used the night before, that she had caught and held on to. She did not smile. But something in her chest that had been clenched, since she smelled the first smoke 3 nights ago, eased very slightly into something that resembled the shape of forward motion. That evening, Pete fell asleep early again. He was healing. She recognized the pattern. The body claiming the unconsciousness it needed, and Sophia and Levi sat on opposite sides of the fire, in the particular quiet of 2 people who have said the important things, and are now in the territory that comes after, which is both easier and more complicated. Tell me something that isn't about Harlow Creek, she said. He looked at her over the fire. What? Tell me something ordinary. Something about this place, or about yourself before all of this. She shifted in her chair. I've heard the hard things. Tell me something else. A long pause. Before I came up here, he said slowly, I used to keep bees. She blinked. Bees. My mother kept them, she taught me. The flatness in his voice had changed slightly, not warm, exactly, but less defensive. There's a particular kind of attention you need for it. You have to be slow and completely present, and you can't have anything else in your head while you're doing it. He looked at the fire. I found it useful. Do you keep them up here? Tried. The winters are too hard. Do you miss it? He considered the question with the same seriousness he brought to everything. I miss the attention it required, he said. Not thinking about anything except what's directly in front of you. She understood that perfectly. She understood it in her bones. I used to make bread, she said, back in Ohio before I came west. Every Saturday morning. My grandmother taught me. She looked at her wrapped hand. There's something about working dough with your hands. It requires exactly enough of your attention to push everything else out. He looked at her across the fire. Why did you come west? He said. It was the first purely personal question he had asked her. She felt the small significance of it. My husband died, she said. 4 years ago. Fever. We had a farm and a plan, and then the plan was just mine. She said it plainly, without self-pity, because it was simply what had happened. I decided I could stay in Ohio and tend the same ground with the same memories at every corner, or I could go somewhere new and build something that was purely mine. She looked at the fire. I picked the second thing, and Harlow Creek burned it. Harlow Creek burned it, she agreed. The fire settled. A log shifted with a sound like punctuation. They didn't burn what you built before the settlement, he said. She looked at him. The thing that made you knock on a door in the middle of a mountain night and tell the most feared man in the territory to make you leave. His eyes were steady. That's not something anyone can burn. She was quiet for a moment. That might be, she said carefully, the closest thing to a compliment you've managed in 2 days. Don't make too much of it, I won't. But the fire was warm. And the storm was still moving across the mountain with its patient and indifferent force. And inside the cabin something had shifted in the space between them, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the particular permanence of things that change without asking permission. She went to sleep that night knowing, with a certainty she could not entirely explain, that when the storm broke, everything that came next was going to be different from everything that had come before. Not easier, not safer, but different in the way that matters, the kind of different that only happens when two people who have both been carrying something alone for a very long time look at each other across a fire, and, without saying it directly, begin to consider the possibility of carrying it together. And that possibility, fragile as it was, became the thing that pulled them both through the next morning when the storm finally broke and the real work began. The silence after a mountain storm is a specific kind of silence. Not peaceful, cleared, as if the world has been wrung out and set to dry, and everything left standing has proven something about itself. Levi was already outside when Sophia woke. She could hear him moving around the perimeter of the cabin, checking for damage with the methodical attention of a man who trusted nothing to be fine without verification. She lay still for 30 seconds, taking inventory of herself the way she had begun doing each morning since the fire hand. Bad but manageable back, stiff but functional mind, alert and already working, and then she got up. Pete was awake, sitting on his blanket with his knees pulled up, and a piece of dried venison in his hand, staring at nothing in particular. I need to go back down, he said before she could speak. She sat across from him. I know. He stopped. He looked at his hands. I know what happened. I've known since that night. I just haven't said it out loud yet. You don't have to say it out loud yet. I think I do. His jaw worked. I think if I don't say it, I'm going to keep not saying it until it gets too heavy to carry. He looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes that were dry because he had already done the crying part privately in the hours she had been asleep. He didn't make it out, Sophia. No, she said quietly. I don't think he did. Pete nodded once, stiffly, like a man much older than 16 absorbing a fact that he had already decided he was going to survive. I have an uncle in Pryor Creek, he said. My father's brother. He doesn't know me well, but he's family. He pressed his lips together. I think that's where I should go. I think that's exactly where you should go. And you? He looked at her directly. What are you doing? She heard Levi's footsteps returning around the corner of the cabin. I'm going to Millhaven, she said. Pete left after breakfast. Levi gave him the spare horse without being asked, and without making anything of it, And he gave him enough dried food for 3 days and directions to Prior Creek that he delivered in a quiet, precise manner, not warmly, exactly, but with the steady seriousness of a man who understood that what he was handing this boy was something real and necessary. Pete listened to every word without interrupting. At the door, Pete stuck out his hand to Levi. Levi looked at the hand. Then he shook it. "You're a good man," Pete said. It was not a child's compliment. It was a young man's assessment, delivered with the gravity of someone who had recently had his understanding of the world rearranged, and was rebuilding it piece by piece with more care than before. Levi said nothing, but his hand stayed on Pete's for an extra second before releasing. Pete turned to Sophia, and she pulled him into a brief, firm embrace, and he let her, and then he straightened up and squared his shoulders and walked to the horse. She watched him ride down the mountain until the trees took him. She did not cry. She saved that for later, for a private moment, and she knew it would come. But this was not the time for it. This was the time for the next thing. She turned around and Levi was watching her from the doorway. "How long to Millhaven?" she said. 2 days riding hard. 3 comfortable. We don't have 3 comfortable." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "we don't." He went inside and came out 10 minutes later with the wooden box under his arm and a pack over his shoulder and his rifle in his hand. She had her coat and her burned hand, and the absolute refusal to let either of those things be the reason something didn't happen. They rode south. The first hour of the ride was almost silent. Not uncomfortably, they had passed through the stage of silence that comes from not knowing what to say and arrived at the stage that comes from having already said enough. The mountain released them gradually, the trees thinning as they descended, the cold becoming something less absolute and more merely unpleasant. It was Sophia who broke it. "Tell me everything you know about the men specifically," she said. "Not the company, the men." Levi kept his eyes on the trail. "The one who runs the operation now goes by the name Caldwell. Warren Caldwell. He came into the territory about 7 years ago. Before him, it was a man named Seward who died of something natural, which was the only natural thing he ever did." A pause. "Caldwell is careful. He has legitimate business mixed in with the fraud, so that anyone looking at the surface sees a real land development company. He has relationships with 2 county commissioners and at least 1 territorial judge." Sophia felt the familiar cold settling in her chest that came with understanding exactly how large a thing she was looking at. "And the document fraud, is that his work specifically?" "His attorney's a man named Price. Daniel Price. Price is the one who alters the dates and the boundary descriptions. He has access to the Territorial Records Office because he's filed enough legitimate documents over the years to be trusted there." Levi's voice was steady and precise. "Price is the weak point. Why? Because Caldwell doesn't know it. But Price has done this before. Not for Caldwell, for another client, 12 years ago, in a different territory. The fraud was smaller, and it was settled privately, which means there's a record of it somewhere that was meant to disappear but didn't entirely." Sophia turned to look at him. "How do you know that?" A pause. "Because the family it happened to 12 years ago was the Prater family," he said. "The ones I sent to Garrison 2 years ago." She processed this. "The same attorney who defrauded your family was later hired by Caldwell. Price moves where the money is, and the money has been with Harlow Creek for the past 7 years. Does Garrison know about Price's history?" "He knows some of it. Not the connection to my family's case." He looked at her sidelong. "I've never put those 2 things in the same room for anyone before." She understood what he was not saying directly. That putting those 2 things in the same room meant walking into a conversation where his family's case, his mother's death, his father's collapse, 9 years of mountain isolation became evidence in a legal argument. It meant offering the most private and painful thing he owned to a purpose that required it to be handled by other people, in a public context, with no guarantee of the outcome. "You're going to have to tell Garrison all of it," she said. "I know, including your mother." A long silence. "The horses moved steadily beneath them," he said again. She did not push further. She had learned, in 2 days in that cabin, the specific difference between the moments when Levi Hunter needed to be pressed and the moments when he needed to be given room. This was a room moment. They made camp the first night in a shallow valley between 2 ridges, protected enough from the wind to be practical and open enough that they would hear anyone approaching before anyone approached. Levi built a fire with the same efficiency he brought to everything, and she put together a meal from the supplies he'd packed, and they ate without ceremony. She was wrapping her hand with fresh cloth when he reached across and held the end of the bandage so she could pull it taut. He did it without asking and without comment, the natural action of someone who saw a practical problem and solved it. She looked at his hands doing the small, careful work of holding the bandage end. Your hands are not the hands of a man who has spent 9 years doing nothing, she said. He glanced up briefly. I told you. There's enough work up there for 3 people. I don't just mean the calluses. She pulled the bandage tight and he held while she tied it off. I mean the way you use them, steady, precise. Like you've had to do careful things under pressure. She looked at him. What did you do before the mountain? Before your family's land was taken? He sat back. I worked the ranch with my father, he said. And I rode for the territorial marshal's office, part-time when they needed men for something specific. What kind of specific? The kind that required someone who could find people who didn't want to be found, or deliver documents to places where the person receiving them would prefer not to receive them. She looked at him. You were an enforcer for the law. I was a courier and a tracker. The enforcement was incidental. But you know how to move without being seen. And you know how to find people. Yes. And you know this territory better than anyone. She looked at the fire. Levi. When we get to Millhaven and we talk to Garrison, what happens if the legal route isn't enough? What happens if Caldwell has his judge and his commissioners and Garrison files every document perfectly, and it doesn't matter because the people with the authority to act on it are on Caldwell's payroll? He was quiet for a moment. Then we find a different kind of authority, he said. Meaning what exactly? He looked at her directly. Meaning the territorial governor's office has a marshal who is not on Caldwell's payroll, because I know this because I once rode for that marshal and the man is constitutionally incapable of being bought. A pause. And meaning that there are 11 families who have been quietly helped down from mountains and pointed toward attorneys over the last 9 years, and some of them still have the documents I told them to keep. And some of them would be willing to come forward if someone with a legal argument solid enough to protect them asked them to. She felt something shift in her chest, not the small directional thing from 2 nights ago, but something larger. Something structural. You've been building this for 9 years, she said. Haven't you? He didn't answer immediately. I told myself I was just helping where I could, he said. I told myself I wasn't ready to do more than that. He looked at the fire. But I kept the documents, I kept the photographs. I kept track of the families. A pause, and his voice dropped slightly. Maybe I was waiting for something. What were you waiting for? The fire crackled between them. He looked up from the flames and found her face across them. Something that made it feel like it wasn't too late, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said with complete steadiness, It's not too late. They arrived in Millhaven late on the 2nd day, arriving at the edge of town as the light was going bronze and long. Sophia had been in Millhaven twice, before it was the largest settlement, within 3 days of her former homestead, which made it the place you came when you needed something the smaller towns couldn't provide. A doctor, a legitimate attorney, a telegraph. She felt the town differently now than she had on those previous visits. Before it had been a destination, a place she came to and left. Now it felt like a threshold. Something was going to happen here, or it wasn't, and the difference between those 2 outcomes was the box under Levi's arm, and the willingness of a man who had spent 9 years on a mountain to finally walk back into the world and say what he knew. She watched him ride into the town, and she watched the town react to him. People noticed. That was the only honest way to describe it. Heads turned. A conversation between 2 men on the boardwalk paused mid-sentence. A woman ushering 2 children into a store pulled them a little closer, without seeming to be aware she was doing it. The reaction was not panic, it was more like a collective adjustment, a recalibration of something. Levi rode through it as if he didn't see any of it. She rode beside him and she thought, this is what 9 years of a reputation looks like, moving through a space. This is what it costs a man to have become a story, rather than a person in the minds of everyone around him. You've been here before, she said quietly. Recently. 3 months ago. And they still look at you like that. They'll always look at me like that. He did not say it with self-pity. He said it the way you state a weather condition, a thing that exists independent of your feelings about it. Not always, she said. He glanced at her. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked ahead at the main street. Where is Garrison's office? Elias Garrison was a small man of about 60 with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the kind of organized desk that told you immediately that his mind worked the same way, everything in its place, nothing present that didn't need to be there. He looked up when they came through the door, and his expression cycled through several things in quick succession. Recognition of Levi. Surprise at seeing Levi in his office with a woman he didn't recognize. And then the professional smoothing over that experienced attorneys applied to whatever their face had been doing before it was appropriate. Hunter, he said. He stood. It's been a while, Garrison. Levi set the box on the edge of the desk. This is Sophia Bennett. Her settlement south of the Cedar Fork Ridge burned 4 nights ago. Harlow Creek. Garrison looked at her. Were you hurt? Burned hand, nothing permanent. He gestured to the chairs across from his desk, and they sat and he sat and he looked at the box. What's in there? Everything, Levi said. Garrison looked at him over the reading glasses that had slid back down to the bridge of his nose. Hunter, we have spoken 3 times. Each time you have come in here with pieces of what sounds like a significant case, and each time you have taken his back with you when you left. His voice was not unkind, but it was direct. If something has changed, I need to understand what. Everything is in the box, Levi said again, including the things I didn't show you before. A pause. Including the connection to your family's property. Yes. Garrison sat back in his chair and looked at Levi Hunter for a long moment with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a specific answer for a long time and is now recalibrating around the reality of having received it. All right, he said. Start from the beginning. They were in Garrison's office for 3 hours. Levi talked slowly at first, with the particular awkwardness of a man who has kept something private for so long that giving it words feels physically clumsy, like using a hand that has been still for too long. But he kept going. Because Sophia was sitting beside him, and because Garrison was asking the right questions, and because the box was open on the desk between them, and the documents were real, and the photographs were real, and 9 years of careful record-keeping were real in reality. Once you started walking into it, had its own momentum. Sophia said almost nothing for the first 2 hours. She listened. She watched Garrison's face as he moved through the documents, noting where his attention sharpened and where his expression shifted into something more guarded and more alert. She was building her own understanding of what they had and what it could do. The moment she spoke up came when Garrison reached the survey report and said, almost to himself, the boundary discrepancy is significant. But it's the kind of thing a judge argue either way depending on whether the judge is Caldwell's judge, she said. Garrison looked at her over his glasses. You know about Judge Fenner, she said. It was not a question. Garrison was carefully quiet for a moment. I know that Judge Fenner has ruled in Harlow Creek's favor in 4 of the 5 cases that have come before him, he said. And I know that the 5th case settled before ruling. How did it settle? Confidentially, meaning the family that brought the case was paid to drop it. Garrison looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is impressed and does not intend to say so directly. That would be a reasonable inference, he said. Then Fenner is not our path. She leaned forward slightly. You need to take this above Fenner. You need the Territorial Marshal's office. Garrison glanced at Levi. Levi said she's right. The Marshal's office has jurisdiction if there's evidence of fraud at the territorial record level, Garrison said slowly. Which this he tapped the document pile potentially provides. But making that argument requires someone with standing. It requires a complainant who is willing to put their name on a formal filing. He looked at Sophia at him. My name, she said. And the names of every survivor from the Cedar Fork settlement that I can reach. She looked at Levi. And the Prater family. And any of the others who kept what you told them to keep. Levi met her eyes. She watched something move through him, not reluctance, not fear exactly, but the final passage of something that had been lodged in him for 9 years working its way loose. The Prater family will come forward, he said. I'll go to them myself. Garrison looked between them. This is going to take time, he said carefully. And while we're building the case, Caldwell will not be standing still. If he learns that Hunter has finally brought his documents in, and Caldwell has ears in this town, he will move to protect himself. How quickly can he move? Sophia said. Quickly enough, Garrison took off his glasses and set them on the desk. There are 2 documents in that pile that, if Caldwell knew existed, he would take significant steps to see destroyed. The photographs, specifically. Without them, the case becomes considerably more circumstantial. Sophia looked at the photographs on the desk, the burned ranch house. Her mother's house, though she had not said that out loud to Garrison. Lai had given him the facts without the personal weight of them, and she understood why. Make copies, she said. Tonight. Of everything critical. And get the originals out of this office. Garrison looked at her sharply. Where would you suggest? Somewhere Caldwell's people won't look. She looked at Levi. And somewhere that isn't the mountain. Levi was quiet for a moment. Then there's a pastor in Cedar Fork, Reverend Alcott. Alcott's church burned, Sophia said. He survived? He was one of the ones who got out. She thought of the old reverend, his 12 years of work reduced to ash in an evening. He's at Eckhart's trading post, or he was. He's a man who has kept confidences for 30 years. And he's angry. Looked at her. An angry pastor, he said slowly, with 30 years of the community's trust, who just had his church burned by the people we're building a case against. He'd be a powerful witness, Garrison said. His voice had taken on a different quality, the focused, almost hungry tone of an attorney who can see the shape of something starting to come together. He'll be willing, Sophia said. I know Alcott. They were 20 minutes from Garrison's office, in the room above the hardware store that Garrison had arranged for them when the knock came. It was late, after 10. The kind of knock that happens at that hour is never someone with good news. Levi was on his feet before she had fully processed the sound. His hand went to the rifle, leaning against the wall with the automatic precision of someone for whom that motion was deeply practiced. He put himself to the side of the door, not in front of it, not behind it, but at the angle that gave him the most information and the most options. Who's there? He said, not loudly, just clearly, a voice from the other side, male, young, nervous. My name is Thomas Breck. I work for Daniel Price. The name hit the room like a stone hitting still water. Sophia looked at Levi. He looked at her. His expression had not changed, but his eyes were doing something rapid and precise, assessing, calculating. What do you want? Levi said. I want to talk to the woman from Cedar Fork. I know she's here. I know she went to Garrison's office tonight. A pause. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I came because... Another pause longer. Because I'm the one who makes the copies of the documents. When Price alters them, I'm his clerk. The voice had dropped lower. And I can't do it anymore. Sophia felt the floor shift slightly beneath her. Levi's jaw tightened. He looked at her, and she could see him running the calculation. Threat, or genuine, trap or desperation, the difference between those 2 things and what it cost to get it wrong either way. She made a small, deliberate motion with her head. Open it. Levi's eyes held hers for a moment. Then he opened the door. Thomas Breck was maybe 22 years old, thin, with the kind of face that had been anxious for long enough that it had settled into that expression as a resting state. He was carrying nothing. He was wearing a coat that was slightly too large for him, probably not his own, and his hands were visible and empty, which she thought was probably deliberate. He looked at Levi with the naked fear of someone who has just voluntarily put himself in a very small room with the man everyone in the territory believes is dangerous. His throat worked. Then he looked at Sophia, and something in his expression shifted, not relief exactly, but something that was reaching toward it. He knows, the young man said. Price knows you went to Garrison. Someone told him within an hour. He stepped inside because Levi had opened the door wide enough, and because the young man seemed to understand that standing in a lit hallway was not the wise choice. He's sending men to the records office first thing tomorrow morning. There's a set of documents, original filings from 11 years ago that were altered, that he wants pulled before anyone can subpoena them. Sophia was on her feet. The originals are still in the records office? Copies were filed in the correct place. The originals, the ones with the actual alterations, the physical evidence. Price kept them in a secondary file as insurance. Against Caldwell. Thomas Breck's hands were trembling slightly. He told me once if Caldwell ever turned on him, those files were his protection. But now that Garrison has what he has, Price has decided the risk of those files existing is greater than the protection they offer. Levi looked at Sophia. The timeline had just collapsed from weeks to hours. Where in the records office? Sophia said. Third drawer of the secondary filing cabinet in the back room. The label on the folder reads, Surveyor General Reference Archive 1879. How do you know all of this? Levi's voice was quiet and direct. Specifically, Thomas Breck looked at him. Because Price told me to pull them myself in the morning, he said. And burn them, he swallowed. The Prater family, the ones from 2 years back. Dorothy Prater was my mother's cousin. I knew what Price did to them. I knew, and I kept working for him because I needed the money and because I told myself it wasn't my fault. His jaw tightened, and it was the first thing about him that looked like something other than fear. I'm done telling myself that. The room held the weight of what had just walked through the door. Sophia looked at Levi. The records office, she said. Tonight. Levi's eyes moved to Thomas Breck. Is there a night clerk? Old Burl Jessup. He sleeps in the chair by the front desk after midnight. He's nearly deaf in one ear. Thomas paused. The back window doesn't latch properly. It hasn't for 2 years. Price uses it when he needs access after hours. Sophia looked at Levi, and Levi looked at her, and between them passed the understanding wordless, immediate of two people who have arrived at a point where the next action is not a decision but an inevitability. You stay here, Levi said to Thomas Breck. You do not leave this room, and you do not open this door until we come back. Thomas Breck nodded with the fervent specificity of a man who has no desire to be anywhere else. Levi turned to Sophia. She was already putting on her coat. I know what you're going to say, she said. You're not coming with me. She looked at him steadily. I know that building. I know Millhaven. I know which questions to ask if something goes wrong, and we need to talk our way out of a situation, because I can do that. And with all respect, you cannot. She pulled the coat straight. And because you have spent 9 years protecting people from the outside of things and not letting anyone stand beside you, and that is going to change starting right now. The muscle in his jaw moved. If something happens to you. Something already happened to me, she said. They burned my home. They scattered my neighbors. They killed Pete's father and my friends, and the 12 years Reverend Alcott spent building a church with his own hands. Her voice was not raised. It was steady in the way that deep water is steady, not still, but moving with too much volume to be turbulent on the surface. I am not asking for your permission, Levi. I am telling you that I am coming because this is also my fight, and it has been since before I knocked on your door. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. Stay close, he said, and if I tell you to stop, you stop. The same words she had said to Pete on the mountain. She recognized them, and the recognition moved through her chest in a complicated way. Yes, she said simply. They went out into the dark town, moving quietly. And behind them in the small room above the hardware store, Thomas Breck sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed his hands together and waited. And the night held its breath around all of them. The Territorial Records Office was 4 blocks east, and the window that didn't latch was on the north side, and Levi Hunter moved through the dark of Millhaven, like a man who had spent 9 years learning how to be invisible. And Sophia Bennett moved beside him like a woman who had decided somewhere between a burned settlement and a mountain cabin and a small room with a box of documents that she was done letting other people carry the important things alone. What was in that filing cabinet was going to determine everything that came next. And for the first time since this began, they were going to reach for it together, which was the thought moving through Sophia's mind, as Levi's hand found the edge of the unlocked window and pushed it open without a sound. And the night air moved around them both like it understood the weight of what they were doing, and had decided for once not to interfere. The records office smelled like paper and lamp oil, and the particular dusty authority of a place where official things were stored. Levi went through the window first, and she followed immediately after, and he caught her arm on the way down to keep her landing quiet. His grip was brief and certain, and he released it the moment she had her footing, but she felt the steadiness of it in her hand for several seconds afterward. Burl Jessup was exactly where Thomas Breck had said he would be, slumped in the chair near the front desk, with his chin on his chest and his breathing the slow, sonorous rhythm of a man who had made peace with his night shift responsibilities in a very particular way. The single lamp near the front burned low. The back room was dark. Levi moved through the dark without hesitation, and she stayed close behind him, matching her footsteps to his rhythm. And in 30 seconds they were in the back room, and he was running his hand along the filing cabinet, with the focused quiet of a man reading by touch. Third drawer. The label read exactly what Thomas Breck had said it would read. He pulled the folder and handed it to her, and she held it while he eased the drawer closed. And then they both stood still for 3 full seconds, listening to the building around them. Jessup's breathing continued undisturbed from the front room. Nothing else moved. They went back through the window. On the street outside, Sophia opened the folder under the faint light of the moon and looked at the top document, and what she felt was not triumph. It was something colder and more precise. The specific sensation of a thing you suspected being confirmed in writing, in ink, in someone's actual handwriting in the margins, where they had calculated what the new date needed to be and written the numbers twice to make sure they matched. "It's all here," she said quietly. Levi looked at the document over her shoulder. She could feel the stillness that came off him, not the remote, defended stillness of the mountain, but something concentrated and present and pointed directly at the paper in her hands. "Price's handwriting," he said. "Can you prove that?" "Thomas Breck can prove that." He looked up from the document, and his voice was level, but underneath it was something that had been compressed for 9 years beginning to release pressure. "And Garrison can prove that." She closed the folder. They moved. Garrison answered his door in 90 seconds, which told her he had not been sleeping either. He took one look at the folder in her hand and stood back from the doorway without a word, and they went inside. He read for 12 minutes without speaking, she counted. Levi stood near the window with his arms crossed and his eyes on the street below, and she sat in the chair across from the desk and watched Garrison's face move through the documents the way a skilled reader's face moves, not dramatically, but with small, precise shifts that told her where the significant things were landing. When he finished, he set the folder flat on the desk and put both hands on top of it and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "This is enough," he said. She felt the words go through her. "Enough for the marshal's office," she said. "Enough for the marshal's office, and enough to take to the territorial governor if the marshal's office proves compromised." He looked at her directly. "This is the altered original. This is Price's calculation in the margin in his own hand, combined with Hunter's survey records and the photographs and the testimony of the families." He stopped. "This is not a case we might win. This is a case they cannot defend against if we present it correctly." "Then we present it correctly," she said. "How long do we have before Price sends someone to pull it in the morning?" Garrison looked at the clock on his desk. 4 hours. "Maybe 5. Then you start drafting tonight." He looked at her with the expression she was beginning to recognize on men who were accustomed to being the one in the room who directed the pace of things. "I was going to suggest exactly that," he said. "Good." Then we agree she did not sleep that night. Levi slept for 3 hours in the chair by Garrison's window, the short, efficient sleep of a man whose body had learned to take rest where it could without requiring comfort. And she stayed at the table with Garrison, and answered questions and organized documents, and kept the coffee hot, which was her most consistent contribution to the next 4 hours of work. Thomas Breck arrived at 2 in the morning, because Levi had gone back to the hardware store room to get him, and because Garrison needed his testimony about the document alteration process in writing before dawn. The young man was frightened and exhausted and resolute, in the particular way of someone who has committed to a thing they cannot now uncommit from. And Garrison handled him with the steady professional efficiency of a man who understood that witnesses needed to be kept calm and useful, and not given too much time to think about consequences. She brought Thomas Breck coffee and sat across from him while he gave his statement, and she watched his hand stop shaking somewhere in the middle of the second page, and she thought, "This is what courage looks like when it belongs to someone who doesn't think of themselves as courageous. It's terrifying and ordinary all at the same time." At 4:30 in the morning, Garrison had a filing ready for the territorial marshal. At 5, Levi Hunter rode out of Millhaven toward the Prater farm. She watched him go from the window above Garrison's office, and she did not feel afraid for him, which surprised her when she noticed it. She felt the particular steadiness that comes from understanding that a person is doing exactly what they are built to do. He rode like a man who had been waiting 9 years for a direction to ride in and had finally found it. She turned back to the room and picked up the next thing that needed doing. The marshal arrived in Millhaven 36 hours later. His name was Cole Reardon, and he was a compact, deliberate man of 50 who wore his authority the way practical people wear a good coat, not for display, just because it was the right tool for the conditions. He had ridden from the territorial capital with 2 deputies And he had read Garrison's filing twice on the road because one of his deputies had told her this. Later, and he arrived already understanding the shape of what he was walking into. He sat across from Garrison and Sophia in Garrison's office, and he read the documents in the folder, the originals, the altered ones, with Price handwriting in the margin, and he did not look at the ceiling when he finished. He looked at Sophia. "You pulled these from the records office," he said. "The night before, Price's clerk was scheduled to destroy them on Price's instructions," she said. "You can verify that from Thomas Breck's sworn statement." "I intend to." His eyes moved to the window, where Millhaven was going about its morning business, outside with no understanding of what was happening in this room. "Caldwell is going to hear I'm here within the hour. These towns don't keep secrets, I know. He'll move to protect himself." "I know that too." She looked at him steadily. "Which is why the first thing you need to do is secure Price." "Not Caldwell Price. Caldwell has commissioners and a judge. Price has those documents and a clerk who is already talking." She paused. "Price is the thread. You pull Price and the rest of it unravels on its own." Reardon looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've had 36 hours and very little sleep," she said. Thinking was the available activity. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Acknowledgement of the specific kind that comes from one practical person recognizing another. "Where's Hunter?" he said. "Riding back with witnesses," Garrison said. "He should be here by tomorrow morning." "How many?" "The Prater family. Possibly 2 others." Garrison folded his hands on the desk. "Hunter has relationships with 11 families who've had contact with Harlow Creek's operations over the past 9 years. He's been keeping records." Reardon's expression shifted into something more focused. 9 years, he said. "He's been on that mountain for 9 years, Sophia said. Watching what Caldwell does, and keeping documentation and helping families find legal resources, and waiting until there was enough to make it mean something." Reardon was quiet for a moment. "I've heard the stories about Hunter," he said. "Most people have," she said. "Most of them are wrong. Price was arrested before noon." Reardon moved fast, and he moved quietly, which was exactly what the situation required: 2 deputies, and a sworn warrant, and a very brief conversation at Price's office door that ended with Daniel Price being walked down the main street of Millhaven in front of everyone who had known him for 7 years as a legitimate territorial attorney. Sophia watched it from across the street. She had positioned herself there deliberately, not out of satisfaction. Satisfaction felt too small and too clean for what she was actually feeling, which was something rawer and more complicated, but because she needed to see it happen with her own eyes. She needed to have it be real in a way that was confirmed by her own witness rather than someone else's account. Price did not look up as he was walked past. But a man standing outside the feed store did look up. And he looked across the street at Sophia. And she recognized him because she had made a point of learning what Warren Caldwell looked like during the past 36 hours, asking Garrison and Thomas Breck separately for a description until she was certain she had an accurate composite. Warren Caldwell was heavyset and well-dressed, and somewhere in his mid-50s, and he was looking at her with the expression of a man who has just watched something he considered impossible happen in broad daylight on a street he considered his own. She held his gaze. She did not look away. He turned and walked in the other direction, and she watched him go with the absolute certainty that he was not finished, and that what had just happened was the beginning of his response, not the end of it. She went to find Reardon. "He's going to run," she said. Reardon looked up from he had commandeered an office in the county building, and he had been in it for 4 hours, and the surface of the desk already had the organized density of a man doing serious work. "I know. I have a man on him. 1 man isn't enough. Caldwell has 2 commissioners in his pocket, and if either of them gets word to him about your authority in this territory, he'll know whether running is worth it or whether he has enough protection to stay and fight." She sat down across from him. "Does he have enough protection to fight?" Reardon considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "He has Fenner," he said, "and the 2 commissioners. Those are real cards." He paused. "But the governor's office is another matter. The governor has been looking for a reason to deal with Fenner for 2 years, and this," he tapped the folder on his desk, "is considerably more than a reason. You've already contacted the governor's office. Last night, by telegraph." He met her eyes. I told you I read the filing on the road. She felt something in her chest release, another increment of the tension she had been carrying since the moment she smelled smoke 6 days ago. What did they say? They said to proceed and to keep them informed, and that Fenner has been relieved of territorial jurisdiction over any case involving Harlow Creek pending review. The deliberate understatement of a man who knew how to carry authority without making theater of it. Which means Caldwell's judge is no longer Caldwell's judge. The chessboard had just changed completely. She was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. He'll definitely run now, she said, if he knows. Then we'd better make sure he doesn't know yet. Levi arrived the following morning. She heard the horses before she saw him, and she was outside before she consciously decided to be, standing at the edge of the street. And when he came around the corner, she took him in with the immediate, involuntary attention of some checking that a thing they value has arrived undamaged. He was fine. He looked tired, and he had been riding hard, and he was fine. Behind him came a wagon with 4 people in it, a man and a woman in their 40s and 2 adult children. All of them with the particular look of people who have spent some hours deciding whether they are doing the right thing and have arrived at the conclusion that they are. Dorothy Prater's family. And behind the wagon, another horse with 2 riders, a brother and sister. She would learn. From a homestead north of Cedar Fork, who had their own story and their own documents and their own 9-year-old anger that had finally found a direction to move in. Levi pulled up his horse and looked down at her. Price is arrested, she said. Something moved through his face. The documents, he said. Safe. Garrison has copies in 3 separate locations. She looked up at him. He's good, Levi. He's the right man. He dismounted, and she was aware, as he landed beside her, of how close they were, standing closer than the width of a street required, and neither of them moved to correct it. Caldwell? For now. She held his gaze. Reardon has someone watching him. Levi looked past her at the county building, and she watched him take in the shape of what had happened in his absence, not the specific details, but the fact that things had moved, that the machine was running, that the thing they had set in motion was moving under its own weight now. You've been busy, he said. I had a good teacher. She met his eyes. You kept records for 9 years. I just pointed them at the right people. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had not seen on his face before, open, in a way that he had not allowed himself to be in her presence, without the careful, maintained level quality that she had come to understand was not coldness but protection. Come meet the Prater family. Yes, she said. And then we need to talk to Reardon together. There's something we haven't covered yet. Caldwell's next move. She turned toward the county building. He's going to try to come after you specifically. Your credibility. 9 years on a mountain. Levi, he's going to put someone in front of Reardon who says you're unstable or violent or worse. He's going to try to make the source of the evidence the story, instead of the evidence itself. Levi was quiet for a step. Let him try, he said. I intend to be prepared when he does. She looked at him sidelong. Which means you need to tell Reardon about the man you killed with your bare hands before Caldwell tells him first. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him and turned to face him. It was self-defense, she said. You've told me that. But Reardon needs to hear it from you with the details, before it comes from Caldwell's mouth shaped into something it wasn't. She held his gaze. Can you do that? He looked at her, with those gray eyes that she had learned to read in the past 6 days better than she had expected to learn anything in that amount of time. Yes, he said. Good. She turned back toward the building. Then let's go. He fell into step beside her, and she felt the particular, altered quality of walking beside someone who is moved from being a stranger to being something that didn't have a simple name yet, but was real and present and weighty in the good way that real things are weighty. The testimony session with Reardon and the Prater family lasted 4 hours and was the most concentrated piece of human experience. Sophia had sat through in recent memory 4 hours of specific, detailed, sometimes painful account giving from people who had been holding these accounts for years and were now placing them carefully into the hands of someone with the authority to use them. John Prater was a methodical man who remembered dates and amounts with the precision of someone who had rehearsed these numbers in private many times, turning them over in the dark, keeping them sharp. His wife Eleanor wept once, briefly, when she described the morning they found their barn dismantled by men who said they had a county order. And then she stopped and continued, with the same steadiness she had presumably applied to every hard thing in her life. Levi sat across from Reardon and described the death of a man named Cole Whitmore, who had come to the mountain with 2 companions, and a weapon and an intention that had been clear within 30 seconds of the conversation starting. And he described it plainly and in sequence, and Reardon listened without interrupting. And when it was done, Reardon said only, "Was there a territorial report filed at the time?" And Levi said there was, in the county of Cedar Fork, and Reardon wrote down the reference number that Levi provided from memory and moved on. Sophia watched the interaction and felt something important settle. Reardon was not going to be manipulated by Caldwell's version of Levi Hunter. He was too practiced for that. He had already formed his assessment, and it was the correct one. The twist came at 3 in the afternoon. One of Reardon's deputies came through the door without knocking, which was not the deputy's usual manner. And Reardon looked up from his notes and said, "What?" And the deputy said, "Caldwell's gone. His horse is gone and his office has been cleared. Looks like he left sometime in the last 2 hours." The room went very still. Reardon was on his feet immediately. Sophia looked at Levi. Levi's jaw was set and his eyes had gone to something distant and calculating. He said quietly. Reardon looked at him. "He has a property north of the territory line," Levi said. "A legitimate one, bought it 6 years ago, under a different name. I didn't know about it until last year, and I didn't know it was him until 3 months ago." He looked at Reardon directly. "I should have told you this earlier. Why didn't you?" Reardon's voice was controlled, but there was an edge in it. "Because I didn't know if I was going to walk through your door until 2 days ago," he said. It was not an excuse. It was a plain statement of fact, and Reardon received it as such. "What's the property name?" Filed under a William Cole. "Ridgecrest Timber. It's about 60 miles north." Reardon turned to his deputy. "Ride. Get ahead of him if you can. I'll send the second wire to the Northern Marshal's office immediately." He was already moving to the door, and then he stopped and turned back. He looked at Levi. "You know this territory," he said. "Better than anyone you have available," Levi said. "I need someone who can tell my deputies where he might stop, where he might veer off the northern road, what the terrain does between here and Ridgecrest." Levi stood up from his chair. Sophia stood up too. "Not this part," he said. "Marshalman's." "Not this part," he repeated, and his voice was not unkind, but it had the weight of a man who was making a decision about operational risk and had made it. "Hunter knows the land. I need Hunter. You are the primary complainant, and you are the person who pulled those documents from that filing cabinet, and you are the reason this case holds together. And I am not putting you on a hard northern ride after a man who, if he's running, has decided he has nothing left to lose." He held her gaze. "I need you here in one piece. Do you understand me?" She looked at him. She looked at Levi. Levi was watching her with an expression that told her he agreed with Reardon and that he was not going to say so out loud, because he understood her well enough by now to know that him saying it would make it worse rather than better. She understood the logic. She hated the logic, and she understood it. "Go," she said. She looked at Levi when she said it, not at Reardon, at Levi. "Go and come back." He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved through it, not the compressed, careful thing he had been carrying for 9 years, but something warmer and more present and directed entirely at her. "I'll come back," he said. He said it the way you say things you intend to keep. Simply, with the weight of intention behind every word. The next 30 hours were the hardest she had spent since the fire, and the fire had been objectively worse, which told her something about how much the quality of waiting had changed when the thing you were waiting for had a face you had come to know. She was not idle. There was too much to do for idleness. Garrison needed her to review the final compiled filing for error. The Prater family needed lodging arranged. Thomas Breck needed to be kept calm and useful, and pointed toward the formal deposition that Garrison would take from him in the morning. Reverend Alcott, she had sent word to Eckhart's trading post, and the old Reverend had arrived late the previous night with a determination in his eyes that she recognized as a man who had watched something he built with his own hands be destroyed, and had decided that grief was a thing you did while moving, not a thing you stopped. For Reverend Alcott needed to be walked through what his role in the testimony would look like and what questions Garrison would ask him, and how a formal legal proceeding differed from the kind of account-giving he was accustomed to from 30 years of pastoral experience. She did all of these things with the deliberate focus of a woman who understood that focus was the tool she had available. And she used it the way Levi used his hand steadily. Precisely. Without waste. But in the spaces between tasks, in the 15 minutes before sleep finally took her in the room above the hardware store, in the early morning before the town was fully awake, she was aware of a specific and unfamiliar sensation in her chest that she examined honestly and identified accurately. She was afraid for him, not the general fear that comes with dangerous circumstances. The specific fear that belongs to a specific person, the kind that has weight and shape and a name attached to it. She sat with that honestly. She didn't dress it up, and she didn't push it away. She looked at it the way she had looked at everything difficult in the past 6 days directly, without flinching, with the understanding that a thing you can see clearly is a thing you can navigate. She was afraid for Levi Hunter, which meant something had happened in 6 days that she had not planned for and could not at this point unmake. She did not find this unwelcome. She found it terrifying and real and entirely unexpectedly welcome. He rode back into Millhaven at dusk on the second day. He was alone, which made her heart cease for one cold second until she saw the expression on his face and understood that alone did not mean it had gone wrong. She was outside before he reached the hitching post, and she stopped herself from running, which took a specific and deliberate effort. He dismounted and turned and looked at her across the short distance between them. "They have him," he said. "Northern Marshal's office took him at the Ridgecrest property." He didn't fight it. When they showed him the warrant and the list of charges, he paused. He sat down and he asked for an attorney. She felt the breath leave her body all at once. Not a question. Not exactly. More like the first moment of saying something aloud that your body already knew. "The legal part is starting," he said carefully. "It won't be fast. Garrison says months, maybe longer. But Caldwell is in custody and Price is in custody, and the evidence is in Reardon's hands," and he stopped. She said. He looked at her across the fading light of the evening. "The Territorial Governor's Office issued a formal review of every land Creek has filed in the past 12 years, he said. "Including my father's." She went very still. "Levi. Garrison told me an hour ago, by telegraph from the Capitol." His voice was level, but something underneath it was not level, and she could hear it, and she thought that 6 days ago she would not have known to listen for it, and that knowing now felt like the most significant thing. "It doesn't mean the land comes back. The property has changed hands twice since then. But it means the original fraud is on record. It means my mother's death is on record. It means what happened to my family is not a story anymore." His jaw worked. "It's a fact with a document attached to it. In the territorial record." She took 2 steps forward and she put her hand on his arm. He looked down at her hand. Then he looked at her face. She had known. In the cabin. In the storm. Across the fire. That something was changing between them. She had known it and she had not named it. Because naming things too early makes them fragile, and she was not a woman who could afford fragile things. But standing here, in the last light of the day, with his arm under her hand and 9 years of his solitude beginning to crack open around the edges, she thought that some things earned their name regardless of whether you were ready for them. "You came back. I told you I would." "I know." She looked up at him. "I was still afraid." He looked at her for a long moment, and she felt him taking that in, not the surface of it, but the real thing underneath it, the thing it meant that she had been afraid specifically for him. His hand came up and covered hers on his arm. "I'm here," he said. 2 words, plain and level, and carrying the full weight of a man who did not say things he did not mean. "Yes," she said. "You are." The town moved around them in the ordinary indifferent way that towns do, horses and voices and the smell of supper cooking somewhere, and the sound of a door swinging shut, and inside all of that ordinariness, something was becoming true between them that had been building, since a burned palm woman knocked on a mountain door and refused to be turned away, and neither of them looked away from it. Garrison needed them inside. There was still work to do. But for this one moment, in the last bronze light of a day that had changed everything, Sophia Bennett and Levi Hunter stood still together and let it be real, and that reality, fragile as new wood and twice as strong, became the foundation everything else was built on in the months that followed. The legal proceedings moved the way Garrison had warned them they would, not fast, not clean, but with the grinding, Incremental momentum of a thing that has enough weight behind it to keep moving regardless of what tries to slow it down. Warren Caldwell hired 3 attorneys. Daniel Price hired 2 and then fired them and hired a third. Judge Fenner was formally removed from territorial jurisdiction within the first month, which sent a message through the county commissioner's offices that resulted in one commissioner resigning quietly and the other requesting a private meeting with Marshal Reardon that lasted 4 hours and ended with that man's full cooperation in exchange for considerations that Reardon was too professional to discuss publicly. Sophia attended every proceeding she was required to attend and several she was not. She sat in hard wooden chairs in territorial courtrooms and answered questions from men in suits who had been paid to make her sound unreliable. And she answered them the way she answered everything directly, without embellishment, with the specific factual precision of a woman who had kept her own records and knew exactly what she had seen and when she had seen it. Garrison told her after the 3rd session that she was the best witness he had put in front of a territorial hearing in 20 years of practice. She told him that was because she was telling the truth, and truth was easier to keep straight than a lie. He almost smiled, almost. Levi testified once, in a session that lasted 6 hours, and she sat in the back of the room and watched him give his account in the same level. Unhurried voice he used for everything, the voice that people who didn't know him read as cold, and people who did know him understood, was simply the sound of a man who meant exactly what he said and was not performing anything. He walked the hearing officer through 9 years of documentation with the methodical precision of someone who had organized this material in his own mind so many times that delivering it was merely a matter of following the order he had already established. When the opposing attorney tried to introduce the story about Burl Cassidy the trapper who had allegedly disappeared after visiting the mountain, Levi looked at the man and said flatly, "Burl Cassidy is alive and living in Denver near his daughter. Her name is Margaret Cassidy Walsh, and she lives on Larimer Street. You're welcome to verify this." There was a pause in the room, and then the attorney moved to his next question, without further comment on Burl Cassidy. Sophia in the back of the room looked at her hands so no one could see her expression. The formal verdict on the Harlow Creek fraud case came down on a Tuesday in late April, 4 months after the night they had pulled a folder from a filing cabinet in the dark. Garrison sent word by messenger to where Sophia was working. She had taken a temporary position helping the Prayer with spring planting, while the proceedings concluded, because she was not built for idleness, and the Prater land was close enough to Millhaven that she could be there when needed. She was in the field when the message came, and she read it standing up, with soil on her hands and the sun overhead, and Eleanor Prater watching her from a few feet away, with the careful attention of a woman who understood that the news in that letter touched all of them. Sophia read it twice, then she looked up at Eleanor. "Caldwell," she said, 12 years federal, Price, 8 years, and disbarment. The 2 commissioners, fines and removal from office," she paused. "And a formal territorial order requiring Harlow Creek Land Development to cease all operations and submit all filed land claims for independent review." Eleanor Prater sat down on the ground where she was standing. Not dramatically, just the simple physical fact of her legs deciding they were done, holding her up for the moment. "All of them?" Eleanor's voice was barely audible. "All the claims?" "All of them," Sophia said, "including the original claims against families who were displaced." "Including yours," pressed both hands over her mouth. Sophia stood with the letter in her dirty hands and felt the thing she had been moving toward for 4 months arrive not with fanfare, not with the dramatic rush she might have imagined in the early days, but quietly and completely, the way water finally fills a space it has been working toward for a long time. It was done. Not everything was fixed, nothing was simple. The land that had been fraudulently taken could not all be returned. Some of it had changed hands legitimately since the fraud, and those cases would be argued separately. And some families would receive compensation rather than property. And that was a different and lesser thing than what had been taken from them. She understood this, but Warren Caldwell was going to federal prison. Daniel Price would never practice law again. And every family who had been handed a fraudulent document and told to get off land they had built their lives on was going to have their case reviewed by someone who was not on Caldwell's payroll. It was enough to be going on with. She rode to Millhaven. Levi was at Garrison's office when she arrived. He had been there since morning. waiting in the same way he did everything without visible agitation, in the chair near the window, with the contained patience of a man who had spent 9 years waiting for things and had made a certain peace with it. He stood when she came through the door. She held up the letter. He read it standing in about 45 seconds. Then he folded it and handed it back to her and looked at her face, and she looked at his, and between them passed the full weight of everything that letter meant, not just Caldwell and Price and the verdict, but his parents' land, his mother's death, 9 years on a mountain, the night she knocked on his door, the storm, the fire, the box of documents that had been sitting on a shelf waiting for someone to understand what to do with them. It's not the land back, he said quietly. No, it's not my mother. No, but it's the truth. On record. With a document attached to it, the way you said. He looked at the letter in her hand for a moment longer. Yes, he said, it is. Garrison came in from the back room with the particular energy of a man who had just won the most significant case of his career and was trying to behave professionally about it with limited success. The governor's office is issuing a formal statement this afternoon, Garrison said. Reardon is holding a public address in the main square in 2 hours. He looked at Levi. They're going to name you specifically. Your documentation and testimony are cited in the formal verdict, as and I'm reading this exactly instrumental to establishing the pattern and scope of the fraud. He put the paper down. The territory is going to know your name by evening. Not the mountain man story, your actual name. Levi was quiet for a moment. James Levy Hunter, so said. He looked at her. That's what the document said, she said. Your father's land grant. James Levi Hunter. A pause. That's who gets the credit today. Something crossed his face that she had never seen there before, and that she could not entirely name. It was complicated in the way that things are complicated when they involve both grief and something that is not quite the opposite of grief, but exists in the same neighborhood. All right, he said. Reardon's address drew most of Millhaven into the main square, which told Sophia something about how thoroughly this case had worked its way into the awareness of the community. People who had been watching Harlow Creek operate for years and who had said nothing out of fear or calculation or simple proximity to the wrong side of the power arrangement. Those people were in that square. She could see it on their faces. The particular expression of people who are relieved and ashamed of their relief in roughly equal measure, because the relief implies they had been afraid, and being afraid of something you should have opposed is not a comfortable thing to sit with. She stood at the edge of the crowd and listened to Reardon speak with the plain, authoritative clarity of a man who understood that the people listening to him needed facts more than they needed rhetoric, and she watched the crowd process what he was saying in real time. The shifts in posture, the heads turning to neighbors, the occasional audible exhale of someone hearing something they had needed to hear for a long time. When Reardon cited Levi's name and contribution, a specific thing happened in the crowd. She felt it before she could identify it, a shift in the collective energy of a large group of people, a kind of recalibration. The man they had made into a story for 9 years was being given back his real dimensions in public, in official language, by a territorial marshal. And the crowd was adjusting to this, the way people adjust to discovering that something they feared was not what they feared it to be. She looked for Levi in the crowd and found him near the back, standing slightly apart in the way he always stood in groups of people, not antisocially, just with the instinctive spatial preference of a man who had spent 9 years with only himself for company and had not yet fully unlearned it. A man standing near him said something. She was too far away to hear what. Levi turned and looked at the man and said something back, and the man nodded, and then the man stuck out his hand and Levi shook it. She felt that handshake in her own chest. Then a woman nearby said something to Levi. And then there were 2 people. And then 3. And she watched the feared mountain man of the Cedar Fork territory stand in the middle of a crowd that was relearning who he was and receive it with the same level. Steady quiet he brought to everything, not basking in it, not deflecting it, just letting it be real. She turned away to give him that moment without her watching it. Reverend Alcott found her at the edge of the square. He was a thin man in his late 60s, with a face that had been weathered by 30 years of frontier winters and 30 years of other people's hard occasions, and he carried his grief about the burned church the way he carried everything visibly. without pretense, and with the pragmatic acceptance of a man who understood that life continued regardless of what it burned on its way through. He's going to be all right, Alcott said, without preamble, nodding in the direction where Levi was still standing with the growing cluster of people. I know, she said. Do you? He looked at her with the direct, unhurried attention of someone who had spent decades in the business of understanding what people actually meant when they said things. Because knowing it here, he tapped his temple, and knowing it here, he moved his hand to his chest, are two different things, and one of them you've had for a while, and one of them you've only recently started working on. She looked at the old reverend. You're more perceptive than is strictly comfortable, she said. 30 years of pastoral work, he said mildly. You develop certain skills. She was quiet for a moment. He built something on that mountain, she said. Not just the cabin. Something in himself, the records, the families he helped, the way he held on to what mattered even when holding on to it cost him everything comfortable. She paused. He built all of that alone, and then he came down and put it in Reardon's hands, and testified in that hearing room and did the hardest thing, which was letting other people matter to him again. She looked at the square. I don't want to be the person who allowed him to come back to the world and then didn't stay. Alcott nodded slowly. That, he said, is the right thing to know. He walked away toward the square, and she stood where she was for a moment, with the afternoon sun on her face, and the noise of the crowd in her ears, and the particular clarity of someone who has said, out loud, a thing they have been privately certain of for longer than they admitted. The twist that had been working its way toward her arrived that evening, and it arrived in the form of a letter. She was at Garrison's office. They had gathered there after the address, the small group of them who had built this case, for a quiet meal that Garrison's clerk had organized with touching practicality when a boy brought it in from the telegraph office, addressed to her specifically from the Territorial Land Office in the capital. She opened it. She read it. She read it again. The Prater family parcel was being restored in full, subject to final review. 3 other displaced families from the Cedar Fork area were receiving similar rulings. And Sophia Bennett, identified as the primary complainant and documented resident of the Cedar Fork settlement for 3 years prior to its destruction, was being offered a land grant under the displaced settler provision, a parcel of 60 acres, adjacent to the Cedar Fork Ridge, with clear title and no encumbrance. 60 acres. Adjacent to the Cedar Fork Ridge. Adjacent, if she was reading the survey coordinates correctly, to land that bordered the lower slope of Levi Hunter's mountain. She looked up from the letter. Levi was across the room, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee, talking to John Prater in the quiet, substantive way she had learned. He talked when he was comfortable, not much, but meaningfully. He glanced at her because she had been silent for long enough that the silence had a different quality than ordinary silence, and when his eyes found her face, he went still. What? He said. She walked across the room and handed him the letter. He read it. His eyes moved to her face. 60 acres, she said. I know what it says. Adjacent to the Cedar Fork Ridge. I know where the Cedar Fork Ridge is, Sophia. I know you do. She held his gaze. I wanted you to know that I know. He looked at her for a long moment. John Prater had tactfully found something else to look at. Garrison was very carefully examining a document on his desk. The room had the particular quality of people trying to give 2 other people the privacy of a public space. What are you going to do with 60 acres? Levy said. His voice was careful in the specific way. It was careful when he was working out something he wanted to say correctly. Build something, she said. Something of my own. Something I chose. The same thing I was doing before. The same thing. With modifications. She looked at him directly, because directness was the language they both spoke best. The settlement I had before I built it alone, because that was what was available. This time, I'd rather build it with someone who has already proven he knows how to build things that last. The room was very quiet. Levi Hunter looked at Sophia Bennett across the small distance of Garrison's office. And she watched something in his face that had been in the process of opening since the night she knocked on his door complete the last part of that, the last defended, carefully maintained boundary dissolve, not dramatically, but the way things dissolve when they have served their purpose and are no longer needed. 60 acres is not a lot. You'd need access to water. The creek line on that parcel runs dry in late summer. I know. The cabin on the mountain has a spring-fed source that runs year-round. A pause. Piping it down to the lower land is possible. I've looked at the grade. She felt the breath move in her chest in a way that was complicated and warm and completely real. You've looked at the grade, she said. I had time to think up there. What exactly were you thinking about? His jaw moved. The corner of his mouth shifted, not quite the near smile she had seen once before, but in the same family as it. Various things, he said. Were any of those things me? He held her gaze. Some of them, he said. The moment she had been waiting for, not the verdict. Not the restoration notice. But the actual moment that belonged to no one else, and to no official proceeding, came 3 days later. On the mountain. He had gone up to check the cabin, and she had gone with him, because she wanted to see it again with the different eyes she had now, the eyes that had 6 months of him attached to them. They rode up in the early morning, and the mountain received them the way it always received things, without comment. With the patient indifference of something that has been there, long enough to find everything that happens on it, roughly equally unsurprising. The cabin was exactly as she remembered it, the spring-fed water, the shelves. The fireplace built by a man who understood that warmth was not a luxury. The window that looked south, toward the valley, toward everything that had happened. She stood in the middle of the room and turned slowly and felt the weight of what had occurred here, the storm, the box of documents. The fire lit between two people, finding their way toward each other with all the careful uncertainty of people who had both been badly hurt by the world and had learned to be methodical about trust. Levi came in behind her and stood at the door. It's smaller than I remembered, she said. You were terrified the first time you saw it, he said. Fear makes spaces feel larger. She turned around. I wasn't terrified. You were. You hit it well. He crossed the room and stopped in front of her and looked at her with those gray eyes that she could now read the way you read something you have studied until it becomes part of your own understanding. You were terrified and you knocked anyway. I didn't have another option. You had the option of turning around. He held her gaze. You didn't take it. I didn't. He reached out and touched her face, not tentatively. Not dramatically. Just with the same steady, certain quality he brought to everything. The quality of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it. His hand was warm, and she felt the rough texture of it against her cheek, and she stood still and let herself be present in this moment, without analyzing it or managing it or holding any part of herself back from it. I don't have much to offer, he said. A mountain. A cabin. A reputation that's going to take time to rebuild. You have 60 acres adjacent to the Cedar Fork Ridge, she said. And a spring-fed water source with a favorable grade. The near smile arrived fully this time, the real version of it, the one that changed his whole face into something that she thought probably very few people in the last 9 years had ever seen. That too, he said. She put her hand over his where it rested against her face. Levi, she said. I didn't survive a fire and a mountain storm and 4 months of legal proceedings to be talked out of what I want by a man who is trying to be careful with me. She held his gaze. I don't need careful. Honest, he said. He looked at her for a long moment with everything he had stopped keeping in reserve. I don't want you to go, he said. I haven't wanted you to go since the second morning when you brought me coffee without being asked and set it on the fence post and walked away. He paused. I've spent 9 years building a life for one person because one person was all I trusted the world to give me. Another pause, and his voice was as level as it always was, but underneath it was every honest thing he had not said to anyone in 9 years. I was wrong about that, and I don't intend to keep being wrong about it. She stepped forward and closed the small remaining distance between them, and when she kissed him it was with the full, unhesitating commitment of a woman who had knocked on an impossible door and refused to leave and had been right to do both. His arms came around her with the same certainty, not desperate, not tentative, simply the gesture of a man who had decided and was done with the deciding and ready for the thing itself. They came down from the mountain together in the afternoon. Pete Walcott was waiting in Millhaven. He had come from his uncle's in Pryor Creek when he heard the verdict, riding 3 days to be there for the people who had been there for him on the worst night of his life. Because he was 17 now and had grown into the kind of young man who understood that showing up was not optional when it mattered. He looked at Sophia and Levi, standing together, and the look on his face held the particular warmth of someone who has witnessed a thing arriving at its right conclusion. So, Sophia said, You two worked it out. We worked something out, she said. Don't make too much of it. Pete looked at Levi with the direct simplicity he'd had since the first morning in the cabin. Levi looked at Sophia. She's going to build, he said. 6 south slope of the Cedar Fork Ridge. Pete absorbed this in you? I'm going to help her, Levi said. Pete nodded slowly with the gravity of someone young enough to still find this kind of news genuinely moving and old enough not to make a scene about it. Good, Pete said simply. That's good. The last thing happened 6 months later, on an ordinary morning in early autumn, when there was no crisis and no proceedings and nothing required of either of them, except the ordinary work of the life they were building. Sophia was outside at the new structure on the 60-acre parcel walls, going up slowly. Built right. Built to last. In the method of a man who had spent a year on a mountain, learning exactly how permanent a thing could be when you refused to rush it. Levi was beside her. They had been working since dawn. A rider came down the road from the north and stopped at the property line and called out her name. She walked over. The rider was a young man from the Territorial Land Office with a final document, the completed title, fully registered, her name on it in clean official ink. Sophia Bennett, 60 acres, clear and unencumbered. She took the document and looked at it, and then she looked at Levi, who had come to stand beside her with sawdust on his hands and the quiet, steady presence that she had stopped noticing as remarkable because it was simply what he was steady, present hers. She folded the document carefully and put it inside her coat, against her chest. Well, she said. Well, he said. She looked at the walls going up in front of them. She looked at the mountain above them. His mountain, the one that had been his refuge and his exile, and was now simply the place above the place they were building together. She looked at the man beside her, James Levi Hunter, whose name was on a territorial record now, whose truth was in the official documents, who had come down from his mountain and found that the world could hold him after all. Then she picked up her hammer and went back to work. And he went with her. That was how it ended. And that was how it began. And for two people who had both lost everything and refused to stay lost, it was exactly enough.